For millions of Germans, World War II did not begin as a story of evil. It began as humiliation, hunger, rage, and the promise that Germany would rise again. After the disaster of World War I and the crushing economic collapse of the 1920s, many ordinary Germans saw Adolf Hitler not as a monster, but as the man who restored pride, work, and hope to a broken nation. And that is what makes the German perspective of World War II so terrifying. Because to truly understand the war, you must understand how an entire population could slowly become trapped inside a machine of nationalism, propaganda, fear, and total war. From the streets of Berlin to the frozen trenches of Stalingrad, German soldiers and civilians experienced the conflict not as distant villains in a history book, but as human beings caught inside one of the darkest storms ever created by mankind. The rise of revenge, pride, and total belief. Germany in the 1930s did not feel like a nation preparing for apocalypse. To many Germans, it felt like a nation finally waking up from humiliation. The memory of World War I poisoned the country like a wound that never healed. Veterans returned home defeated, starving, and psychologically destroyed. The Treaty of Versailles had crushed Germany economically and emotionally, forcing the nation to accept blame for the war while surrendering territory, military strength, and enormous reparations. Hyperinflation turned money into worthless paper. Families burned stacks of banknotes just to stay warm. Men who once fought proudly for the Kaiser stood in bread lines unable to feed their children. For ordinary Germans, democracy became associated with weakness, humiliation, and chaos. And in that chaos, Adolf Hitler appeared like a man promising resurrection. His speeches were not simply political speeches. They were emotional explosions designed to awaken anger, pride, and vengeance. He promised jobs. He promised strength. He promised revenge against the powers that had humiliated Germany. Most importantly, he promised to make Germans feel proud to be German again. And for many people, he delivered exactly that. Factories reopened. Massive military projects created employment. Roads, weapons, and infrastructure transformed the economy. German cities began to feel alive again. Young men suddenly had purpose. The military returned as a symbol of honor instead of defeat. To millions of ordinary citizens, it genuinely seemed like Hitler had saved the nation. Propaganda intensified this image every single day. Radios filled homes with speeches glorifying unity and sacrifice. Posters portrayed Germans as strong, disciplined, and destined for greatness. Children in schools were taught that Germany had been betrayed in World War I and now faced enemies everywhere. Entire generations grew up inside an environment where nationalism became inseparable from identity itself. The regime understood something terrifyingly simple. If you control emotion, you control reality. For young German boys, especially, the Nazi years felt intoxicating. The Hitler Youth transformed childhood into preparation for war. Boys marched in uniforms, sang patriotic songs, and trained like future soldiers. Many truly believed they were part of something heroic. Adventure, discipline, and brotherhood replaced uncertainty and poverty. By the late 1930s, Germany felt unstoppable. When German troops marched into Austria and later into Czechoslovakia, many civilians celebrated in the streets. Hitler appeared to be achieving victory after victory without serious resistance from Europe. To ordinary Germans watching these events unfold, it looked like history itself was bending in Germany's favor. Then came September 1st, 1939. German forces invaded Poland using Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, and mechanized infantry moved with terrifying speed. For German soldiers, the early phase of the war often felt shockingly successful. Entire enemy positions collapsed in days. Cities surrendered rapidly. The Wehrmacht appeared almost invincible. Soldiers wrote letters home describing victory, excitement, and confidence that the war would end quickly. When France collapsed in only 6 weeks during 1940, the sense of triumph inside Germany exploded. The French army had once been considered one of the strongest in Europe, yet it fell with astonishing speed. German troops marched through Paris while civilians back home celebrated what seemed like proof that Germany had become the dominant power of Europe. But behind the celebrations, the machinery of brutality was already expanding. The Nazi regime was not simply fighting military enemies. It was constructing an ideological war built around racial hatred, extermination, and conquest. Many ordinary soldiers did not fully understand the scale of what was happening yet. Some remained focused entirely on military duty and survival. Others gradually became exposed to the horrifying realities unfolding behind the front lines. The deeper Germany moved into Eastern Europe, the more the war transformed into something savage beyond imagination. When Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union believing they were participating in the final destruction of communism and securing Germany's future. Propaganda portrayed the invasion as a civilizational struggle. Many troops expected quick victory similar to France. Instead, they entered hell. The Eastern Front became the most brutal theater of war in human history. Endless fields, freezing winters, and relentless Soviet resistance shattered the illusion of easy conquest. German soldiers suddenly faced an enemy willing to sacrifice millions to stop them. At first, advances remained enormous. Entire Soviet armies were encircled. Cities burned across the horizon. Columns of prisoners stretched for miles. German soldiers often described feeling overwhelmed by the scale of Russia itself. The distances were endless. Villages looked primitive and devastated. Roads turned into oceans of mud. Supply lines collapsed constantly. Yet despite these difficulties, many troops still believed victory was inevitable during the early months. Then winter arrived. The German army had not prepared properly for prolonged winter warfare. Temperatures dropped to levels many soldiers had never imagined possible. Engines froze solid overnight. Weapons malfunctioned. Men slept inside snow-covered trenches wearing inadequate clothing. Frostbite destroyed fingers, toes, and faces. Soldiers woke up beside comrades frozen to death during the night. The Soviet counterattacks came with relentless fury. Suddenly, the war no longer looked glorious. It became survival from one day to the next. Letters sent home began changing tone. Excitement turned into exhaustion. Confidence turned into fear. German soldiers witnessed death on an industrial scale. Entire villages vanished under artillery fire. Human bodies froze into grotesque statues in the snow. Tanks burned across frozen landscapes while wounded men screamed for medics who could never arrive in time. The psychological pressure became unbearable. Yet retreat was often forbidden. Hitler demanded absolute resistance no matter the cost. Inside Germany itself, civilians slowly began realizing the war was not ending quickly. Food rationing intensified. Families received death notices constantly. Bombing raids from the Allies began turning German cities into ruins. But propaganda continued insisting victory was near. Many civilians clung desperately to hope because the alternative, admitting disaster, felt impossible. Fear also played a massive role. Speaking against the regime could destroy entire families. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Suspicion spread everywhere. And still, millions continued believing. Not necessarily because they were all fanatics, but because admitting the truth meant confronting the terrifying reality that Germany was marching toward catastrophe. The Nazi state had fused nationalism, fear, propaganda, and survival into a single emotional system. For many ordinary Germans, separating themselves psychologically from that system became almost impossible. The war consumed every aspect of existence. Fathers disappeared to the front. Mothers struggled to survive bombings. Children grew up hearing air raid sirens instead of bedtime stories. Then came Stalingrad. And for countless Germans, that was the moment the illusion finally began to die. Stalingrad collapsed, and the end of the German dream. When German forces entered Stalingrad in 1942, many soldiers believed they were approaching the final victory of the war. Hitler saw the city as both a strategic and symbolic target. Capturing the city carrying Stalin's name would humiliate the Soviet Union and demonstrate German dominance to the world. But Stalingrad became something far worse than a battle. It became a black hole that swallowed an entire generation of German soldiers. The city itself looked like the end of civilization. Buildings collapsed into mountains of concrete and twisted steel. Fires burned endlessly through the ruins. The air smelled of smoke, blood, oil, and rotting corpses. Every street became a battlefield. Every apartment building became a fortress. German soldiers who had once conquered entire nations with speed now fought room by room, staircase by staircase, sometimes for weeks over a single building. Soviet defenders refused to retreat. Snipers hunted constantly from shattered windows. Artillery exploded day and night without pause. Men lived underground like animals surrounded by rubble and death. German soldiers later described Stalingrad as a place where humanity disappeared completely. There was no glory there, no heroism in the cinematic sense, only exhaustion, hunger, terror, and survival. Corpses covered the streets so densely that soldiers sometimes used frozen bodies as cover during firefights. Rats fed on the dead while wounded men screamed in basements without medicine. Water became precious. Ammunition ran low. Sleep became almost impossible. Then winter returned. And this time, the German army was trapped. The Soviet counter-offensive surrounded the German Sixth Army inside the city. Suddenly, nearly 300,000 German soldiers found themselves encircled with almost no chance of escape. Hitler refused to authorize retreat. He demanded that the army hold its position no matter the cost. Supplies dropped by aircraft were nowhere near enough. Hunger consumed the trapped soldiers slowly. Horses were slaughtered for food. Frozen bread became harder than stone. Disease spread rapidly. Frostbite destroyed thousands. Soldiers wrote desperate final letters to families knowing they would probably never leave Stalingrad alive. The psychological collapse was horrifying. Men who once believed Germany was invincible now understood they had been abandoned inside a death trap. Soviet artillery pounded the ruins continuously. Temperatures fell far below freezing. Some soldiers simply stopped moving and allowed themselves to die in the snow. Others lost their sanity completely. Suicide became common. Entire units disappeared under constant bombardment. When the final surrender came in February 1943, it shattered Germany psychologically. The myth of invincibility was dead. Nearly an entire army had been annihilated. Of the hundreds of thousands trapped there, only a fraction would ever return home after years of Soviet captivity. Across Germany, families waited for letters that would never arrive. Mothers, wives, and children slowly realized their loved ones had vanished into the frozen ruins of Stalingrad forever. From that moment onward, the war transformed into a nightmare of retreat and destruction. German soldiers on the Eastern Front were pushed backward relentlessly by the growing strength of the Soviet army. Entire cities that Germany had conquered were lost again one by one. The Wehrmacht still fought with terrifying effectiveness, but the strategic situation was collapsing. Fuel shortages crippled tanks and aircraft. Young teenage boys and elderly men were increasingly sent into combat because so many experienced soldiers were dead. Meanwhile, Allied bombing campaigns intensified across Germany itself. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden turned into infernos. Civilians experienced horrors that felt apocalyptic. Firestorms consumed entire neighborhoods in minutes. Oxygen vanished from the air as flames created massive tornadoes of heat. Thousands suffocated inside shelters. Mothers searched through ruins for missing children. Streets filled with ash and burned bodies. For ordinary German civilians, the war they had once celebrated now existed directly above their heads every night. Fear became the defining emotion of daily life. Fear of bombs. Fear of Soviet revenge. Fear of starvation. Fear of the Gestapo. Fear that Germany itself was dying. And by 1945, it was. As Soviet forces advanced toward Berlin, millions of German civilians fled westward in panic. Stories of atrocities committed during the Soviet advance spread rapidly, creating mass terror. Refugee columns stretched endlessly across frozen roads. Women carried children through snow while old men pulled carts containing the last remains of their lives. Allied aircraft sometimes attacked refugee movements from the air, adding even more chaos and fear. Germany itself had become a collapsing battlefield. Inside Berlin, the final days felt unreal. The once proud capital of the Third Reich became a city of ruins and desperation. Buildings burned constantly under Soviet artillery fire. Teenage boys from the Hitler Youth were handed anti-tank weapons and ordered to defend the city against experienced Soviet troops. Many died within hours. Civilians hid inside basements, listening to explosions shake the ground endlessly above them. Even then, propaganda continued insisting miracle victories were coming. But almost nobody truly believed anymore. In Hitler's bunker beneath Berlin, the leadership of Nazi Germany descended into paranoia and collapse. Hitler himself had become physically and mentally broken. The empire he promised would last 1,000 years was dying after only 12. Around him, loyalists argued, panicked, and searched desperately for impossible solutions while Soviet forces closed in from every direction. For ordinary German soldiers still fighting in 1945, survival became the only remaining objective. Ideology faded beneath exhaustion and fear. Many simply wanted to live long enough to surrender to the Western Allies instead of the Soviets. Entire units collapsed. Others fought fanatically to the end, either from belief, fear of punishment, or refusal to accept defeat. Then, finally, Berlin fell. When Hitler committed suicide in April 1945, the war's final illusion disappeared completely. Germany surrendered days later. What remained was devastation beyond comprehension. Millions were dead. Cities lay in ruins. Families were shattered forever. Soldiers returned home psychologically destroyed, if they returned at all. And slowly, as the concentration camps were liberated and the full scale of Nazi atrocities became undeniable, ordinary Germans were forced to confront the horrifying reality of what their nation had become. That confrontation would define Germany for generations. Because the German perspective of World War II is not simply the story of villains marching toward defeat. It is the story of how nationalism, propaganda, humiliation, fear, and blind loyalty can slowly transform an entire society until millions become trapped inside a catastrophe they can no longer control. And that is what makes it so terrifying. Not because it feels distant from humanity, but because it feels painfully human.